Firegirl Chapter 6. Mrs. Tracy held on to her smile, but it was clear that something really wasn't right about the whole second announcement. The pink was draining from her cheeks as she looked at us all. Then I noticed that she didn't so much look at us as over and around us. Jessica, she said, is a girl who has... She stopped and looked at the door. What? Kayla said softly behind me. There was a tap at the door, and 2 or 3 kids in the middle of the room whispered and leaned forward to see out into the hallway. The door opened, and the janitor walked in, sliding a desk noisily ahead of him. Where? He said to no one in particular. In the back, please, Mrs. Tracy pointed to the end of the second row. The addition of another desk would make that row the longest. She's putting the new girl in the back of the room, Kayla whispered to me. I think I'll take back what I said Eric, just loud enough to be heard. Shh, said Samantha Embriano. The janitor scraped the desk along the floor between the first and second rows. I didn't like the way he did it. He could have carried it, after all. He set it down at the end of the second row, spacing it perfectly from the desk in front of it, with a flick of his wrist. When he left, we all turned to Mrs. Tracy. Jessica has suffered a horrible thing, she said. A couple of kids made noises. Their seats squeaked. Jessica was in a fire. She was burned, badly burned. She'll be going to school at St. Catherine's while she has treatments at a hospital in New Haven. Some girl whispered, "Oh," suddenly, and it sounded like she had hurt herself or something. We all looked, but the teacher went on. I don't know how long Jessica will be with us, but I want you to be prepared. Her burns are... She does not look like anyone you have ever seen before. Mrs. Tracy's voice caught and faded away for a second. Some of the kids seemed to get stiff in their seats. Others began shuffling things. I felt nervous, as if I had been caught doing something wrong. But I know that you will treat her as good children should. She stopped again. It was like a kind of wave passed over the class when she finished talking. I felt icy and weird in my stomach, as if I was really hungry or really full. I kept on sweating, and my forehead was damp along with my waist. It must be horrible, I thought. If Mrs. Tracy talks like that, saying this girl was badly burned, it must be horrible. And this girl is coming into our class? I remember thinking that as long as the teacher kept talking to us, even about a bad thing, the bad thing wouldn't happen yet, because she had to tell us all about it before it happened. But now that Mrs. Tracy had said what she had said and stopped talking, there was nothing more between us and whatever it was that was waiting between us and Jessica Feeney. I suddenly wished that while we were waiting, Mrs. Tracy would say something totally different, not about this girl, whoever she was, but about the weather, or TV, or the class elections. She should go through all of that again, the primary, the voting, the committees, Thanksgiving, anything that takes our mind off the whole badly burned thing she had just said. I wanted to hear something, anything, to assure us that even after this girl came into our class, things would still be normal and regular. I tried to imagine something about a volcano and a submarine, but I kept looking at Mrs. Tracy and nothing would come. She just twisted her hands for a while, then stopped, then waited, and then looked toward the hall. Something was happening outside the door, right now. This was it. The terrible thing was coming. Would somebody actually scream when they saw her? Or say something? Would I say something? Would it be like a horror movie? A hideous creature? Or maybe it wouldn't be that bad. My mother had burned herself at the stove lots of times. Just last week, in fact. The burns were red, sometimes a little white, but they weren't all that ugly. Maybe it wouldn't be that bad. We were not the closest school to the hospital, said Jeff, staring down at the top of his desk. We're not the closest. What? I looked over at him, then back at the door. Mrs. Tracy moved to it, turning the knob. It would be bad. I knew it would be bad. We're a bunch of towns away. We're not the closest Catholic school for anybody to go to, said Jeff. I watched the teacher open the door. Her left hand reached into the hall. She sort of half turned to the class. Her face was so pale then. Finally, she said a bit more loudly than normal, "Class, I'd like you to welcome our new student." She took the girl's hand and drew her in. "Everyone, say hello to Jessica." As horrible as I thought the girl would look when I imagined what burned people looked like, it was nothing compared to what had just stepped into our room. Jessica Feeney's face, the first thing everyone looked at, was like a mask. I looked at her, then away, and then back at her. I couldn't believe I was looking at the face of someone alive. The skin was all rough and uneven. It looked almost smeared and was stained all shades of pink and white and red. Her lips were swollen. They nearly filled the space between her nose and chin. Her eyes peeked out from behind skin that looked melted. Her hair was mostly short. Her arms were covered, except that the forearms were bare and blotchy. Her fingers were bent as if she were trying to grab something. My neck felt thick and stiff. There was a lump in my throat and a high ringing in my ears. I remember wondering how someone looking like that could even be alive. Was she in pain right now? It seemed like she must be, as if being in that skin would make you want to scream and scream and scream until you died. There was no screaming. It seemed like all the sound went out of the room for a long time while this girl stood there in front of us waiting. She stood stooped over in a brown dress. She had thick gray tights covering her legs. It wasn't the St. Catherine's uniform. Finally, she said, "Hi," in a small, tight voice, breaking the silence. Her mouth and cheeks hardly moved when she spoke. The skin on her throat was stretched and smeared like the rest of her. She's burned everywhere, I thought. Someone whispered something, and I felt my whole face go red. "Shut up, everyone, shut up. No, I mean talk. Fill the room up with noise. Be a regular class again now. Do it, now, do it." Mrs. Tracy seemed confused at first, but then said, "Will the people in row 2 please move back 1 seat each?" Her face was now as white as I'd ever seen it. "Jessica, we sit in alphabetical order here, so your seat is at the head of row 2. "Okay," she whispered. Without a word, Jeff collected his stuff and got up from his desk. So did the others. They moved back 1 seat. Everyone else tried to look busy as the new girl stood there waiting. Finally, she sat down at her desk. Jessica Feeney, the burned girl. Without making much of a fuss, Mrs. Tracy went straight into science.